Hello, explorers, and welcome to Reach the World's Explorer program. For more than 25 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens through virtual exchange. My name is Tim, and today we're diving back into the amazing world of supercomputing, research software engineering, and the power of computers to drive discovery. In just a minute, you'll meet Melissa Floca from the San Diego Supercomputing Center, and we'll hear all about how supercomputers can help us minimize the damage of wildfire in the Western United States. If you haven't already read Melissa's wonderful virtual exchange article, I've added a direct link in the chat area. This will take you to the Virtual Exchange Journey homepage where this and all future articles for this program will be published. We have such a great group of classrooms participating in this program, and I want to give a brief shout out to a few of those classrooms. Hello to Miss Mesk students in Brooklyn, New York. Hi, Miss Mesk. Hello to Miss Rivas' students in River Edge, New Jersey, Miss Alvarez's students in Chicago, Illinois, Mr. Strayer's students in Norman, Oklahoma, and Miss Ayabonte's students in Thornton, Colorado, just to name a few. I'm so glad you're joining us for this learning journey. If you are joining us via YouTube today, I'm excited to see any and all questions you have for Melissa. Please add them to the chat at any time, and we'll fold them into today's event. And with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to today's very special guest, Melissa Floca, and I will bring her up on screen. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, good morning, Tim.
It is great to have you here today. I know a lot of us have been looking forward to talking to you because we've learned just a little bit about supercomputers and software engineering and this world of technology. And now today we get to learn about a real world problem that is being addressed by this amazing technology. So we're going to dive into that in a little bit, but I thought maybe before we did that, we could get to know you a little bit and hear about how you came to be in the job you are and what your interests and passions and hobbies are. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Yes, I'm really excited to join today and to share some of our work with you all. You know, I started working in disaster response and management because of something that happened to me personally. So I grew up in New Orleans, and after college, my first job was in New Orleans at Tulane University. And in 2005, just very shortly after I started working there, there was a very bad Hurricane Katrina, that happened, and it destroyed a lot of the city and caused many people to lose their houses, lose their jobs. And I worked then after Hurricane Katrina on some projects related to rebuilding the city. And I saw how hard it was to be prepared for an unprecedented disaster like that hurricane, and then how hard it was to help people respond and rebuild. And so a lot of my career has been focused on thinking about how we can use technological innovations and solutions to help in those kinds of situations.
Wonderful. And can you tell us what you do now? What is your job? Where do you work? What is a typical day like for you?
Sure. So I work at the San Diego Supercomputing Center, which is part of the University of California in San Diego. And we have a lab at the Supercomputing Center called the Wi-Fi Lab, where we build tools that the fire management community uses. And so a lot of my work is helping our technologists, our data scientists, our computer scientists, the people who are domain scientists as well, so hydrologists, physicists, helping them work together more effectively and understand the kinds of problems and challenges that firefighters have and others in the fire management community have, to make sure that the tools that we build are going to solve the most important challenges and problems that they face.
All right, excellent. I know you have a lot more to tell us about that today. So I just want to, before you dive into your presentation, I want to let everybody know that a link to Melissa's article is in the chat. If you haven't had a chance to read her introductory article, which I thought was wonderful, and you can read that anytime, probably after we talk to Melissa, if you want a reminder on some of the cool work that she is working on. But I will bring up your deck here, and I will turn it over to you. I'll go into the background, so I'm not leaving you. I'm just not on the screen anymore.
Great, thank you. Yes, so today I'll be talking about how we harness AI and, of course, the supercomputing data and science that goes along with that for fire management and also for training. And I want to make two main points in my talk today. The first is that you can only use artificial intelligence if you start with the operational experience of firefighters. So you really need to understand the human challenges, the way that humans are doing their job in order to use AI effectively as one more tool in their toolkit. And then I also want to talk about the potential that we have for new AI-enabled technology to build on data and science and computing, which is really unparalleled today in terms of what we can do, but the challenges that we face in fire management are also unparalleled. So it's really sort of an inflection point where we have the potential for lots of new solutions at the same time that we have lots of very, very critical challenges. So as I mentioned already, at Wildfire Lab, we develop technologies with the fire management community that are driven by cutting edge science and data, the kind of science that the scientists at our university are working on. And our vision is to try to enable tools that can have an impact at the scale of the challenges that we face today. And so supercomputing and technology in general are really important to help us get to that scale. So at Wildfire Lab, we work in a couple of different places and ways. We work on wildfire response. And so there we're working to help firefighters who are responding to wildfires. We also work on prescribed fire. These are fires that are planned and set on purpose in order to change the vegetation characteristics and make particular sites less risky when wildfires do start, or to create fuel breaks that can help firefighters fight fires. And then we also work on providing immersive environments to people. So we're working to leverage the AI readiness of scientific data for new modes of teaching, training, and decision-making, where visualization is really a key part of our work. So one of our first platforms is our Fire Map platform, and I'll talk a bit about that today. But essentially, it helps firefighters do initial attack. An initial attack is when they're deciding how they're going to fight a fire in the first couple of minutes after it's been reported. And so that kind of modeling, the data that we use, the supercomputing that we use, is very different than our Burn Pro 3D platform. Our Burn Pro 3D platform is a three-dimensional fire simulation platform where we are basically looking at a very, very high resolution at fire behavior. And there's not so much the need to do things as quickly because this is a planning tool rather than a response tool like Fire Map. So we use data, we use models, we use science, and we use supercomputing in very different ways for these two products because the people who are using the tools have very different questions themselves. So my first point that I told you I wanted to talk about today is the issue of learning to harness AI by starting with the experience of firefighters. So I want to tell you a story about the inception of our Fire Map platform to sort of emphasize what I mean here. In 2013, the NSF funded, the National Science Foundation funded a proposal that we had, a research proposal, to model fire in real time. And back in 2013, this was a very novel proposal. The goal of the project was to bring lots of different data together, satellite data, weather station data, and to visualize quickly fire models for different audiences. But we really didn't know who was going to need this tool or what it was going to be used for in the real world. And then something very idiosyncratic, very sort of random happened, which was that UC San Diego had an article in a magazine. And back in 2013, on every airplane, there was always, the airplane had a magazine in the seat pocket of the plane. And so this was a magazine ad in a magazine on Southwest Airlines. And our work was highlighted there. So there was a little blurb about how we were forecasting fires. Now, Ralph Terrazas, who was the former fire chief of Los Angeles, happened to be on the plane. He happened to get the magazine out and he took a look at that article, and he was the right person with the right problem because he worked in Los Angeles, and having good models for fires in Los Angeles was very, very important to him. And so he had developed a tool that he held a patent for. It was sort of a ruler. It was a ruler of sorts that they used in their fire trucks with physical maps to help them understand how to respond to fires after they were reported. And so he saw the article about our work and he reached out to us. And so we then, we went and visited them. We took some tours on their helicopters to understand how they were planning and deploying resources for wildfires. We started doing lots of work together to think about how we could model fires and we could share those models with those firefighters. And we built a whole system that is actually used today across the state of California, our fire map system, to help firefighters more quickly model fires and be able to respond to fires as they're starting. And so now they use that tool as one of many other tools. And there's a whole team of modelers across the state of California who work with us and work for the state. And they're modeling every single fire that starts in California. Those models are running on our supercomputer centers, and we have a really quick workflow that goes from the initial detection of wildfire to the initial model of wildfire for firefighters to use. Now, as I think many people might have heard in the recent devastating fires in LA, not all fires are caught on what's called initial attack, so they're not all stopped quickly after they've been started. And so there's always the need to bring in new science, to bring in new data, to bring in new innovation into tools. And one of the things that we're doing right now is adding new fire models, different kinds of scientific models that use different data and different approaches for what's called extended attack, when we don't immediately put a fire out and we need to have models for where and how that fire is going to move over the future hours and days. So I give that example just to really bring home how important it is to understand first the kinds of needs that the users of technology have before we think about the way that we want to use data and supercomputing and AI and science to build new technologies. And now I'm going to move into some of those new technologies that we're building. So our Burn Pro 3D platform is designed to give users access to next generation fire science to plan and implement prescribed burns at scale. And again, prescribed burns are fires that are set by experienced burn bosses very carefully under specific conditions where they're going to reduce the load of vegetation on a landscape or remove it entirely, perhaps from a fire break, so that if a wildfire is to break out, the firefighters will be able to fight it more easily, to stop it more easily. And these prescribed fires are typically require lots and lots of expertise to plan and to carry out, because they're designed to reduce wildfire risk, but without harming the landscapes, without harming the ecosystems where they're being used, and also without exposing communities to smoke that could be harmful to human health. So very similar to our experience with FireMap, we started by going out into the field and taking a look at prescribed burns. This was a prescribed burn that we visited the day after it had happened in Florida. So you can see that there is some clear places where the vegetation was burned, but at the same time, the trees weren't harmed. There weren't a lot of negative impacts to the ecosystem. It was really just to reduce the wildfire risk. And we talked through how we could use data and AI and fire simulations to help practitioners plan these burns. So we then built a tool which uses 3 different components. The first is fast fuels, which is how we're doing the 3-dimensional vegetation modeling. The second is drip torch, which is how we are modeling the ignition strategies. And the third is quick fire, which is how we are modeling the fires themselves. And all of the data and models are being accessed through a web-based interface that's easy to use, but they're running on the supercomputers at the Supercomputer Center so that people don't need to have that capacity on their laptops for storing the data, for running the models, and they can still use them through their laptops through a web interface, but they can leverage the supercomputers to do the job of computing. And so Fast Fuels uses lots of different data to build these 3-dimensional structures of vegetation. Drip Torch lets the practitioners think about how they would like to design the ignition for their fire. And then Quick Fire is a very special fire model that was designed at Los Alamos National Lab. And it is a coupled fire atmosphere model, which means that it takes into account the impacts of winds and conditions, but it also understands that fire itself creates atmospheric conditions that have a feedback loop back into the fire's behavior. So users who use BurnPro 3D through the web interface, they first select their burn area, they generate the 3D vegetation model, they define the environmental conditions like the fuel moistures, the wind speed, the wind direction, and they design their ignition pattern. All of this is then, it's done through the web interface, but it's ingested into the quickfire simulation. So it's handed off to the supercomputers, and then the quickfire simulations are run there. And we're calculating the consumption of vegetation, of fine fuels on the outputs from those simulations. And then all of that is given back to the user through the web interface so that they can find the right environmental conditions and ignition strategies that they need for their planning. And so one of the things that we've found through this work is that it's really, really important to help people be able to visualize data. And all the data that we're using here is 3-dimensional in nature. It's very high resolution. And so thinking about ways to visualize it helps people understand both the data as inputs to models as well as the model outputs for their own decision making. So a lot of our work focuses on the visualization of data. And I'm going to show you a little bit of what that looks like here. So I'll just take a pause to look at a quick video. And now I'll walk you through a bit of information about what you were looking at. So first you are looking at 2-dimensional data. When you look at it from far away, that looks like a pretty rich data source. But when you really zoom in, you can see this is the data at a site called Independence Lake, which is here in California. And you can see that the data it's 2-dimensional, it's flat. The topography isn't flat, but the data itself is just set on top of that topography. And then it's at a 30-meter resolution, which means that each one of those squares of information that you're seeing is 30 meters by 30 meters. And of course, that's a much lower resolution than the actual structure of forests, which are made of tree trunks and leaves and branches and so on. So our fast fuels model is a three-dimensional model. This is still the same site that we were just looking at before in Independence Lake. And the vegetation data is voxelized into 1 meter cubes. And again, all of this data is being calculated and produced at the Supercomputer Center by the supercomputers that we use. And then, you can zoom in and understand that the data has different specifications, like the colors here that you see are different species. But sometimes we need to bring other sources of data together. If you can see in the sort of bottom left corner, there's a lot of kind of low green vegetation there, but actually there shouldn't be. That's a dry lake bed. And so we brought on something called aerial LiDAR data, and we use that next source of data through algorithms and computation to help get a better representation. And so here's the new representation of the data, taking the fast fuels data, but combining it with aerial LiDAR data, which is sensed data from airplanes at a higher resolution to make the vegetation model better. This is a visualization of the aerial LiDAR data itself. So all of the green and the blue points that you see in the water, that's all aerial LiDAR data that was sensed from a special sensor on a plane that flew over this location. And then there, sort of in the middle where you see the white and blue trees, that's actually terrestrial LiDAR data. So the terrestrial LiDAR data is data that, again, it's captured by a sensor, it's a laser, but it is capturing the data from the ground. And so the resolution is even higher. Then you can take a look. You can take a look at that data here, or you can zoom in a little bit closer and see this is the data itself. So each one of the spheres that you see is one point of data that was captured by the laser. And then here's a look at that data again, where you can see that it's a very, very good representation of trees and branches and leaves, and all this is very important for preparing our fire models. And that then gets ingested into fast fuels and into the quick fire model. This is a visualization of our fire model itself running at one time step of the fire simulation. It's running at a 1 meter resolution. So you can see across this landscape, we were modeling the vegetation and then the ignition and then the fire itself. And like I mentioned before, one of the very special things is that there's a model of wind fields that's three-dimensional too. And so the yellow arrows that you can see there are examples of times where the fire itself is causing the wind field to kick up a little bit because the fire is creating wind. We're also able to take, sometimes these prescribed fires are ignited from helicopters. And this is a data set of the ignition coordinates for one prescribed fire that was being carried out, where we have the exact point of ignition for each one of the times that ignition happened. And so here, again, we're just visualizing those points of ignition. And we can look at that particular place with our LiDAR data before the prescribed burn. And then we can see where there were points of ignition during the prescribed burn. And then we can look at the impact there after the prescribed burn. This is a location in the south, and vegetation regrows very, very quickly in these kinds of ecosystems. So if you were to go back maybe 2 or 3 months after this prescribed burn, although today it looks very, very charred right after this particular prescribed burn, if you went back in a couple of months, it would look lush and green again. And so you can use the terrestrial LiDAR scanners to help with that monitoring, to monitor the ecosystem impacts over a couple of months or a couple of years after a prescribed fire. Here is a set of data that you can look at on your phone. So you can use these QR codes, and you can take a look at these terrestrial LiDAR scans on all across the US. So I'll just leave that up for a minute and invite you to capture that and to look at it on your phone if you'd like to learn more. But there you'll see terrestrial LiDAR scans that you can look at in a 360 view, and you can see metrics that are calculated on the terrestrial LiDAR scans. You can see pre and post burn scans in some sites, and you can see the important differences from ecosystem to ecosystem because the vegetation cover looks very, very different in different places across the US. And that's a very important part of our work because different ecosystems have different relationships to fire. And so there are some kinds of ecosystems that are not adapted for fire, that have very low fire return intervals. That means that they experience fire very infrequently. And then there are other ecosystems that are fire adapted, and that fire is a natural part of those ecosystems. Some ecosystems, that means there's a fire return interval of every 5 years, sometimes it's every 10 or 15 years, but there are really important differences from place to place. And this kind of sense data, like the LiDAR data, coupled with the other data sources that we use, are very, very important inputs to the modeling work that we do, important pieces of using artificial intelligence in our workflows. And I think most importantly, given the focus of this talk on supercomputing, they are very, very, very large data sets. And so being able to rely on supercomputing resources to basically do the computing that we need to answer the questions of interest to practitioners would never be possible without leveraging workflows that include HPC, our high performance computing resources, because this is not the kind of data or models or AI algorithms that would be possible on a laptop. And so having access to research supercomputing resources is a huge part of what makes all of this possible. And I think with that, I will end my comments for today and take questions if we have any.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That is fascinating. You've helped me better understand how complicated looking at forest fires or looking at wildfires generally and all the data that goes into figuring out what's going on or what could happen eventually can be. I certainly see now, and I hope the students do too, why a supercomputer might be necessary to understand that beyond sort of the limits of a human's mind. You need some pretty heavy duty computing power to look at that. I'm going to take your presentation down, and we'll share a couple questions that I know our students will be interested in. Many of us have been sort of following over the last couple months the awful wildfires in Los Angeles, and you having started there with your talk, I wondered if you could tell us whether the software that you work with, this sort of process was used in the management of those awful wildfires.
Yes. So those wildfires and many that have come before them are incredibly devastating to communities and to ecosystems. And our FireMap platform is used in California and also in Colorado to model fires when they start. And then those models help with the planning, the initial attack planning on how to send resources to try to put them out. But one of the important innovations that we've worked on over the last decade is how to take real-time information from airplanes. So how to fly airplanes over disasters like fires and quickly take the data that you're gathering and put it back into models. So that's harder than it sounds because you can imagine an airplane takes off. It has sensors. You get data. In the case of wildfires, the data that we're usually looking for is the fire perimeter. So to be able to model the path of a fire, you need to know where it is currently, and you want a lot of very, very good information on the current fire perimeter. And so we take that data from aircraft that are specifically sort of set up in order to provide us those data streams. And we put that information back into our modeling to have better future models of where the fire is, but where the fire is headed. And that same kind of data, the same kind of workflow can be important for other pieces post-fire as well, or in other kinds of emergencies. So we've used the same kind of approaches to map flood extents. It's very hard to know after a large flood event, where are people experiencing flooding? How deep are flood waters? That's a very hard question to answer. And so we use the same approaches to do that. And then similarly, when you're trying to assess damages after a fire, which at a house by house level, which houses have experienced damage from the fire, we use the same kinds of workflows, because of course you can send people out, you can go door to door, but that's very dangerous after a wildfire to send fire personnel to do that. And so it's much better when possible to do things like flood mapping, like damage assessment, using the sense data from airplanes. But again, it really, you need the right algorithms, you need the right workflows and computing power to make that possible.
Okay. I know we have a lot of students who are sort of budding young scientists, and will know that maybe you may have recognized from your talk that all of this starts with good data, that the data you're using to inform your models has to be based on, you gave the example of that there was a lake, a shallow lake, where the first projection of your model did not indicate that there was one. Can you talk a little bit about how the data is collected for your models? How is it the firefighters themselves who are saying this is where the edge of the fire is? Or you talked a little bit about LiDAR, which is a very interesting use of technology as well.
Sure. So a couple of points that I want to make here. I would say the most important point is that there's two different, when we talk about models, sometimes we're talking about lots of different things. Sometimes we're talking about AI models. And so I think increasingly when people say models, they mean AI models. But a lot of the models that we use are not AI models. They're scientific models. So for example, the fire models that we use are, or the flood models that we use, or many of the other models that we use are not our own models. They're models that are created by domain experts. I think the quick fire, three-dimensional fire model that we use is a good example of that, where the person who created that model is a physicist, or has a very strong background in physics, because that model is essentially modeling physics. So many times we use models that are developed by scientists, that are developed by hydrologists, by people with deep domain expertise in particular scientific fields, and those are crucially important for the kind of work that we do. But data and models are like screws and screwdrivers. If you think of a model as a screwdriver, you can only use it with some kinds of screws. And when you try to use a screwdriver with a screw that it wasn't designed for, it's not going to work very well, or vice versa. So when we're thinking about what kind of data to use and what model to use, we're thinking iteratively about what kind of data is available to us and what kind of models are available to us and how those things fit together. So in the example that I was giving you when I started with the vegetation modeling, fast fuels, which is a vegetation model, that model was designed to use two-dimensional data. And so the land fire 30-meter resolution two-dimensional data is gathered by a satellite. And it also uses something else called the forest inventory analysis, which is gathered by humans who go out to vegetation plots all over the country and gather data in the field. And so Fast Fuels was designed to build three-dimensional representations as a model to build three-dimensional representations of data using data gathered from a satellite and data gathered by people, all of which was two-dimensional data. And a lot of the new LiDAR data that we have access to didn't really exist when that was developed. And so now we're building new on-ramps, approaches to pull in that LiDAR data, to transform the LiDAR data, and to give it to the fast fuels model, which is exactly what you saw happening in that visualization, where fast fuels initially didn't know that there was a lake bed there because of the kind of data that it was using. And then we brought new high-resolution three-dimensional LiDAR data to the table, and we were able to build an on-ramp that takes that data and gives it to fast fuels. So yeah, I mean, I think the important points here are that science remains incredibly important to all of these endeavors, and we really rely on this deep expertise of domain scientists. And then as data sources are, we're getting new data a lot, we're getting lots and lots of new data, some of it, gathered by humans in the field, by firefighters, by ecologists, by others, and some of it gathered from these sensing technologies like LiDAR or from satellite data. And we're thinking about how to transform all of that data and use it with the models that we have, and then iteratively how to improve the modeling techniques that we have as new data sources are available.
All right. If I were a local fire chief and I was concerned about the wildfire potential of my area that I was in charge of, when I came to you, what would you ask for? How would we develop a plan for doing the best we could to make sure we weren't going to have wildfires, or we were in the best situation to prevent or manage them?
So we follow a pretty standard innovation approach in our lab. That's something that we've developed as our way of thinking about these kinds of problems. So if we start by understanding what would be useful, what are the kinds of problems that you have as a fire chief? What would be the most useful to you? Where are your pain points? What are the things that you don't know how to solve, or you have processes for, but you're not happy with them? So we always start from that use-inspired problem identification space. And then we think about innovation pathways. So we think about, okay, now that I understand what would be useful to you, what could we build for you? What could we prototype that you would be able to use? And the building blocks of that innovation, that, a usable prototype of innovation for us are data and AI, science, and computing, both the sort of back-end computing as well as front-end software development, and then workflows. And for us, workflows are sort of the recipes for how we bring things together. And so those are the building blocks of innovation for us, where we're trying to prototype, in response to what would be useful, something that would be usable. And once we've understood that piece, that innovation of what would be usable, then we think about how to make it used at scale, which is a very different kind of computing and data problem, because you're moving from a prototype of something that might help to actually, something that can be used at scale, that you're going to have the data everywhere across the world, or everywhere across the state, or everywhere across the country, that the system is always going to be up, that every time you go to use the system, you're going to have enough computing power, and you're going to have everything all worked out so that it always works. And that's a huge challenge in the space of these kinds of unprecedented moments, because or in wildfire, you maybe have a system that no one's ever using until the moment of a wildfire, and then all of a sudden everyone wants to use it all at once, and those are hard technology problems. So yeah, we go through this sort of innovation approach of saying what would be useful, how can we build something that would be usable, and then how can we think about scaling those innovations to make sure that they're used.
Okay, thank you. Do you ever create a model or use your supercomputing and research software engineering to design what you think is going to happen, and then something completely different happens? Do you ever look back and say, wow, like this wasn't exactly right, we need to change this because it didn't capture some aspect of what actually happened in the real world?
Certainly. I think that data and models are always, they're always that. They're never an exact representation of what's going on in the real world, even when they're at a very, very, very high resolution, like the LiDAR scans that I was showing you. There's still some things that you're missing, because if there's a tree behind another tree, then your LiDAR scanner isn't going to be able to see that. You're going to miss that tree is there. And so, that underscores, again, why it's so important to include the users of technology, the practitioners who understand these things in the real world, into all the work that we do. And yes, certainly, on the more technical side, it means that we're always thinking about how to have better data to train models. AI is only ever just as good, and I think this is true for any kind of model, as the data that you give it. So data and understanding the limitations of data is crucial to all of this work, for sure.
Okay, excellent. With the few minutes we have left, I have one more question for you, which is, if knowing everything you know and all the problems you've already done so much work to help solve or address, what is one problem that you would love to solve with this technology? What is one thing that you've observed that you think maybe this technology eventually could really make a big difference in helping to solve?
Yeah, so, I think that there's always a desire, we're always faced with hard trade-offs. So there's always a need to optimize given constraints, which means that maybe you have limited water, or you have limited fire trucks, or you have limited time, or you have limited money. In the case of prescribed burns, that's certainly the case. And this is true not just in wildfire or in prescribed fire, but across all kinds of challenges. How do you make the best decisions that you can, weighing really hard trade-offs where nothing feels like something you want to give up? And so I think that's a really important direction that we're heading in all of this work. So, for example, in California, a prescribed burn challenge that we have is that we have very, very few days where the weather conditions in California are appropriate for prescribed burns. Can't be too dry, can't be too windy. And on those days, we have to be very careful about how much smoke goes out into communities, because the weather might be appropriate for a prescribed burn, but you can't do that many at the same time, or else you're going to harm air quality in a way that's unacceptable for human health implications. And so I think a really, really interesting next step in this work is to think about, given those constraints, how do you optimize plans for prescribed burns across larger areas, given that we have very, very few days where it's possible to carry out these kinds of vegetation treatments.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for giving us such a practical application, or an idea of a practical application for supercomputing power and research software engineering. I found this very, very interesting today. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. That's all the time we do have for today. Tomorrow, we'll be back at the San Diego Supercomputing Center to meet one of Melissa's colleagues, Rick Wagner, who is the Chief Technology Officer there, and he's going to show us what a supercomputer actually looks like. So when we talk about these amazing computers that can process all of this data and help all of these firefighters and other people very rapidly, that's what we're talking about. To our wonderful students and educators, keep looking for new articles on the Reach the World Journey homepage. The link to those articles is in the chat. And after you've read those articles with your class, you'll always have the chance to meet experts like Sandra, Melissa, Rick, and more to ask them your questions. So I'm very, very glad to be on this journey with you all. Thank you again, Melissa. And until next time, keep exploring, everyone. Bye-bye.